Hello. For this presentation, we will be addressing Wells Fargo's recent purchase of new office buildings and move. We will be taking a look at the challenges and some of the ways in which operational management was used to ease the stress of the transition. The background of the project. Wells Fargo is one of Minnesota's largest employers with roughly 19,000 Minnesota-based employees. In 2015, Wells was facing multiple challenges in regards to its Minnesota team members. First, the majority of them were working in rented spaces throughout the downtown Minneapolis area. Rented space was filling up, and the spaces were extremely outdated. Rental costs were high and were only increasing. However, due to business travel and employees choosing to work remotely, each office was only 60% occupied on any given day, even though almost every desk was assigned. It was difficult for teams to get approval to hire employees in Minneapolis because of the lack of available working space. In order to hire an additional Minneapolis-based employee, somebody had to leave. Given these challenges, the objectives Wells Fargo had to face were find additional office space, reduce long-term costs to the company, reassign existing employees so teams that worked together were near each other, and better utilize the space that was being paid for, increase occupancy from 60% to something much higher. In order to meet these objectives, Wells Fargo decided to purchase 2 new buildings in downtown East Minneapolis and move all non-client-facing roles to these offices. Additionally, many workers were transitioned to be flex employees, meaning they primarily worked remotely and used a shared desk when they would come into the office. Wells Fargo had many strengths to leverage in their decision-making. First, Wells Fargo has a strong balance sheet and many assets at its disposal. As one of the biggest employers in Minneapolis, it has the sway with community leaders and can make a big impact in the landscape of downtown Minneapolis. Because the company is set up to function seamlessly across the country, it's easy to transition to a workforce that works primarily remotely. The technology has already been adopted to make the switch to a new office or to flex employees. There are also many weaknesses. The company has been operating the same way for a long time, which makes many employees resistant to change. Customers are used to meeting their bankers or advisors in a certain location and may be unwilling to move to a new location if too inconvenient, which severely limits Wells Fargo's options. There is also a history with Wells Fargo owning the Wells Fargo Tower in Minneapolis, so it can't easily leave this building. Because of the massive size of the organization and high security needs, Wells Fargo can't be as flexible as smaller companies. When Wells decided to build 2 new office buildings, they chose to build them in downtown East Minneapolis, which was less developed than the heart of the city. This meant that employees had limited access to services they were used to, and this made many frustrated. Not only this, but bus services were more limited and were affected by events going on at the stadium. This being said, there were also many opportunities. In the move, there's an opportunity to create more awareness that Minneapolis is one of Wells Fargo's central hubs. In relocating opportunities, there's a chance to restructure how teams are located and drive collaboration between different groups. There's an opportunity to rethink how Wells Fargo's offices are designed and the function the buildings should serve in the community. Additionally, there's an opportunity to offer flex and remote positions which may attract talent. In the new buildings, the new office spaces and conference rooms can be rented out to the community and bring in additional income. That being said, there are threats as well. Because of the proximity to the U.S. Bank Stadium, parking restrictions are in place whenever there are large events, which usually means cars need to be out of the parking ramps by 3 o'clock. This can negatively affect employees and result in a loss of working hours. Some employees are not going to be happy moving to the new office or being assigned to remote or flex alternatives and may leave the company as a result. Additionally, moving towards more flex and remote workers could result in poor performance and distracted employees. Customers may have problems finding the new offices or choose a bank that's closer. No matter what Wells Fargo chose, there were many financial concerns to consider. If Wells Fargo had decided to keep renting, they needed to consider that office space was limited and extremely expensive. Additionally, the expense was reoccurring and would come up every month as long as they were renting. In relocating, there was a sizable upfront investment to purchase the new buildings, to move all the equipment, and relocate employees. Employees needed to be trained in the new buildings and how to use the new flex spaces, which requires funding. And additionally, if productivity does decrease with the new flex structure, that will cost the company as well.
In order to better understand Wells Fargo's position, we performed a SWOT analysis for one of the company's biggest competitors, US Bank. US Bank has many strengths. They consistently rank high in J.D. Power's findings on customer satisfaction, and they do well nationally and exceptionally well in the Midwest. They have also shown a keen ability to acquire new markets, companies, and services, and to fold them into their existing strategies. They are also a market leader in automation, which allows them to scale as needed and move quickly when time requires. However, they also have some weaknesses. Despite spending more time than their competitors on recruitment, training, and development, US Bank has a higher attrition rate with employees. They have been unable to develop business methods outside of their core banking offerings as well. As far as opportunities, Wells Fargo had some recent PR disasters, which left the door open for US Bank to be more transparent with customers and shine a light on their positive practices and contrast those with Wells Fargo. Also, new trends in customer behavior can lead to new markets for all banks, and this is especially beneficial to US Bank, which has the resources and the motivation to diversify and grow. Finally, threats. As younger generations continue to grow into the marketplace, there will be increased skepticism when it comes to the motivations of larger corporations and banks. When it comes to technology, US Bank must innovate or it will fall behind. Smaller companies are moving more quickly and are increasingly in touch with customers, and US Bank must keep up. We also analyzed Wells Fargo's operational challenge in terms of Deming's 14 points. As this table shows, about half of Deming's 14 points apply to this situation. The points that are most relevant and important to our discussion are consistency of purpose, continuous improvement, and leadership at all levels. In order to successfully make this transition, it is very important that everyone is on the same page. Employees need to understand why changes are being made, and leadership at all levels must communicate support for the transition. As part of the company's continuous improvement efforts, Wells Fargo is also monitoring how often employees come into the new office buildings. This will allow Wells to use office space more efficiently going forward by transitioning employees who do not come into the office 3 times a week on average to a flex basis. The building of Wells Fargo's new Downtown East campus was part of a larger project that included new apartment buildings, retail space, a new parking ramp, and a 4.2-acre urban park. The project helped to revitalize a long-forgotten part of Minneapolis, and it would not have been possible without Wells Fargo. Workers and residents alike enjoy the greenery of the park that is otherwise hard to come by in an urban setting, and the nearby light rail means that public transportation is still a convenient option. Furthermore, restaurants, apartment buildings, hotels, and more are now popping up in the area, bringing more jobs and greater prosperity with them. All in all, Wells Fargo's decision to move to Downtown East impacted thousands of lives for the better, which makes it a highly ethical choice. There are also a variety of legal implications related to Wells Fargo moving out of their current leases, purchasing new office spaces, and transitioning to a much more remote workforce. In 2015, Wells Fargo faced a lawsuit, which they ultimately lost, when they tried to capitalize on their proximity to US Bank Stadium and install lit Wells Fargo signs on their rooftops of their 2 new buildings. The idea being that these signs would be captured in any drone footage of the US Bank Stadium. Other legal considerations arise as Wells transitions to a remote workforce. For example, Wells Fargo needs to consider how employees are treated who are not in the office. If it appears that flex workers are treated differently than those in the office, or are not supported in the same way as office workers are, Wells could face legal action. Additionally, Wells has to be much more proactive about training employees on proper document retention and privacy policies. When dealing with clients' personal financial information, it is critical to maintain a standard of privacy. This is one thing to manage in offices, but it is even more difficult to manage when a large part of your workforce is working remotely. There are several aspects of Wells Fargo's move and goal to increase occupancy in their existing office spaces that have regulatory considerations. The first that comes to mind is the licensing of the moving company that is hired to do the moving. Wells will hire an outside contractor to take care of moving, and these companies fall under the oversight of the United States DOT. And Wells Fargo needs to make sure that they are hiring a licensed company for their big move. Another aspect to consider when trying to fill an office space is the fire code limit in relation to the number of employees or people outside in a specific space. This number should be adhered to at all times. Lastly, there's a question of confidentiality. Wells Fargo, as we stated previously, handles a lot of sensitive information for their customers. With that said, there are regulations related to their office space that would require, for example, noise barriers so that people can have conversations without worrying about leaking information.
It's also important to take a look at some of the um, possible resources it would take in order to um, move or to accept some of the alternative suggestions that we had as a team for Wells Fargo. One of the important resources you have to consider is people. This is employees within the organization, how their roles would be affected, but then also employees outside, whether that be consulting companies for interior design or moving companies or construction firms. All of these are resources that have to be considered. Along with that, you also have equipment. Wells Fargo chose to build 2 buildings and to move, and that obviously required a ton of equipment, not only for the construction but on the office side as well. But then you have to consider if they hadn't moved and had gone with a alternative option that would have required much less equipment. And these last two, money and time, really go very closely hand in hand. Um, the decision to purchase new buildings and move office spaces, that's a huge investment of money and time, whereas not doing that would have required a much smaller investment on both ends. So we had two possible alternatives for Wells Fargo, and when they're thinking about moving and configuring their office spaces. Alternative number one was to relocate employees to a campus in the suburbs of Minneapolis. So this would have been a little bit of a different approach. Costs might have looked a little bit different and would have been something that could have potentially provided more space. And then alternative number two was to continue renting current spaces to relocate individuals until all teams and department members were in the same building and within the proximity necessary to work effectively as teams and as individuals. There were some financial considerations for sure when it comes to these moves and also their final choice. Obviously, their chosen path, hundreds of $1 million for new buildings. You have taxes and maintenance, and then you also have just new office space and all of the expenses that come with that. With alternative number one, you have a very similar consideration when it comes to the financial side of things. Cheaper building costs, taxes and maintenance potentially a little bit different. The buildings could have potentially been a little bit bigger depending on where they chose to build. And then for alternative number two, obviously the upfront cost is zero, but higher potential long-term costs in terms of energy efficiency and things like that. You did also have likely going to have some costs when it comes to the reconfiguration and also the opportunity cost of when people are moving, what is the work they're not getting done. That's important to consider as well. Our final recommendation is a little bit unique here. The decision was already made, and so we were simply providing some alternatives and looking at the decisions made. and some references as well. Thank you so much.